Welcome and thank you for joining us today for this engaging kickoff conversation for the new MAS initiative called Enduring Culture. I'm Elizabeth Goldstein, president of the Municipal Art Society of New York. For 130 years, MAS has been lifting up the voices of people in the debates that shape New York City's built environment and leading the way towards a more livable city from sidewalk to skyline. The Enduring Culture Initiative will support an expanded and multivocal field of historic preservation, centering community-led efforts for elevating diverse layers of history and culture. A sense of place involves layered histories, narratives, cultural traditions and practices, as well as community anchors like legacy businesses, public artworks, and urban gardens. These layers are intimately related to the ways communities define themselves, but often lack protection or acknowledgement. And speaking of acknowledgement, let's dive in. I'm honored to introduce the moderator of our panel, Amanda Boston. We are proud to count Amanda amongst our MAS board members. Her research, writing, and teaching focuses on 20th century and contemporary African-American history, politics, and popular culture. Her book project is entitled The New New York, Race, Space, and Power in Gentrifying Brooklyn, and explores the racial operations of gentrification in her hometown of Brooklyn. She is a professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, an adjunct professor at New York University's Urban Democracy Lab, and a consultant to the Laundromat Project. And without further ado, please take it away, Amanda.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for joining us today for Enduring Cultures in a Changing City. Just a quick word about the format of today's event. So first, we'll hear from the panelists who will each give an overview of their work. And following their presentations, I'll moderate a discussion with the group, and then we'll conclude with an audience Q&A. So feel free to add any questions you have for the panelists to the Q&A feature throughout the program. We're honored to host a diverse panel of practitioners today who are creatively building ways to support historical and cultural heritage in the ever-shifting landscape of our city. Our guests today include Kamau Ware, founder and lead creative of the Black Gotham Experience, Shelley Worrell, founder of I Am Caribbeing, Faye Yuan, curator for the Queen's Memory Project, Pete Nice, co-curator for the Hip Hop Museum, and Delma Palma, Vice President of Design and Construction at Empire State Development. But before we begin the presentations, I want to introduce artist Zara Fina Stasi, founder of the New York-based creative studio, Good for the Bees, who will be documenting our discussion today through graphic image capturing.
Thank you, Amanda. Hi, everyone. My name is Zara Fina Stasi, and as Amanda mentioned, I will be doing a capture of our conversation today. It'll be a real-time visual guide that helps synthesize what we talk about. We'll share it throughout the conversation and, of course, at the end so that we can extend this conversation into other arenas, communities, and you can share it with other folks as well to keep them involved and get them excited about this work. So thank you. I'll pass it back to you, Amanda.
So thank you. And now on to the panelist presentations. And first up, we have Faye Yuan from Queen's Memory Project.
Hi, everyone. My name is Faye Yuan, and I'm the curator for the Queen's Memory Project, which is a community-led archiving initiative supported by the Queen's Public Library and Queen's College. I'll talk more a little bit about what community-led archiving means to us, but first, some background on me. So I was born in a beach town about an hour outside Shanghai, China. This picture of me on the upper left is one of my earliest memories. My mom is from the city, not too far from the Bund, what you see here on the bottom left. And my dad's hometown, by contract, was mostly farmland here on the upper right. So when he decided to move to the US in the early 90s, he was looking for something familiar. And the American equivalent of that was Central Indiana, which is where I grew up. And I put this rabbit here because I was born in the year of the rabbit. I wanted to include some things from my astrological heritage, since in Chinese astrology, we are born with certain elements and animals already in our orbit, and both water and rabbit are in mine. Next slide, please. So I'm telling you all of this because if someone were to conduct an oral history interview with me today, these things would come up. And so far, we have collected over 1,100 oral history interviews with Queens residents since the founding of the Queens Memory Project in 2010. And we collaborate with local organizations to bring local history, personal archiving, and story sharing events to community spaces. Because Queens is known as the world's borough, we want to make sure that our collections reflect the diverse perspectives and makeup of our communities. Next slide, please. And nowhere was that more apparent than in the last season of the Queen's Memory podcast, which was a multilingual podcast season made up of 10 episodes recorded in 8 different Asian languages. What we set out to do was that we saw language. When we set out to do this, we saw language as more than just an accessibility tool, but innately tied to cultural preservation. For some Asian communities living in exile, preserving their language is an act of survival. So for example, the Tibetan episode saw nearly equal number of listeners tuning in both Tibetan and English when that episode was released in both of those languages. In other words, people feel seen and therefore listen when you speak their language. Now here at Queen's Memory, we see podcasting as a medium to reach new audiences in the audio storytelling tradition. It creates a new context for people to discover us. And here on the upper right, I've included an abbreviated list of the partners that we worked with on the release of the podcast. And we found that simply recording and publishing the episodes was not enough. We organized live events, what we called community listening parties, sometimes in the communities the stories took place in, to bring people together, to listen and reflect in one place. This idea that we would augment our digital presence with something in person and live really goes all the way back to the beginning of the founding of Queen's Memory. So next slide, please. So at Queen's Memory, we see preservation work both as a reflection of how we got here and also as a dynamic response to what's constantly changing around us. In 2013, for instance, our very first scanning day took place in Broad Channel after Hurricane Sandy. And that's what you see here in the top row of photos. This response kicked off a series of scanning day events across the borough. That we will be out there helping community members digitize records and scan photographs is a form of emergency response in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. And now 10 years later, we are in the midst of producing a new season of the podcast, which will be also about climate-related issues. So we're very much thinking about the climate crisis and how it's constantly shaping and reshaping our neighborhoods. And this idea of a managed retreat, for example, that some communities are so vulnerable to climate change that they eventually will have to move. If that's the case, then the work of documenting and preserving becomes even more urgent. Somebody recently said to me that cities change in times of crisis, and I think that people can too. So this idea that preservation is the practice of managing change, I always think about in relation to the climate crisis we're living in. Next slide, please. And just very quickly, I also want to mention the Queen's Name Explorer project, which is our latest participatory archiving initiative, launched in the fall of 2022 with Urban Archive, our technology partner. And the purpose of the Name Explorer project is to unlock the hundreds of named places in Queens that have people's stories behind them. And it's a project that's deeply rooted in place-based storytelling, essentially using an interactive map. Now, a lot of the named places in Queens are co-named after local heroes. They're known locally, but not nationally. So this is a way to spotlight them and give them greater exposure. But since it is May and National NAA and HPI Heritage Month, I give the example here of Tenzing Norgay, who was a Nepali Sherpa. He was the one who guided Sir Edmund Hillary on his ascent of Mount Everest in 1953. He did not live on the border of Elmhurst and Jackson Heights, which is where a street is currently named after him and where a large Nepali population resides today. However, he represents something special to the Sherpa community and also tied to Nepali culture. And that's equally important to honor and remember. So that's all I have to share about Queen's Memory today, but I have a lot more to say and I look forward to all your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Faye. Next up, we have Shelley Worrell with Little Caribbeing.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shelley Worrell. I'm the founder of I Am Caribbeing, but today we're actually going to be speaking about our place-based programming centering around Little Caribbean in New York City. So just a little bit of background and context. I was born and raised, still reside in Brooklyn, New York, in Flatbush, which is what we call the Caribbean capital of the world. I'm actually sitting in Athens, where I gave a similar presentation earlier. And, one of the things that I always talk about when I present my work in any context is that 20% of New York is of Caribbean descent, with 5 of the 10 top immigrant groups hailing from the Caribbean. So that's Dominican Republic, Guyana, Haiti, Trinidad, and Jamaica. So not only are we the Caribbean capital, we're a diverse Caribbean capital, which led to the development of Little Caribbean in 2017. So I'm just going to take you through a visual of some of the work that we do to center this community in Brooklyn and beyond. On this slide, you'll see a site-specific culinary garden. There are 2 actually that's on view at Brooklyn Botanic Garden, for which we won an Anthem Award in community engagement. That also includes contextual signage that links these specimens back to not only the neighborhood, small businesses, but also to recipes that I wrote with my family. In the center, you'll see one of our culturally responsive programs at Prospect Park at the Lefferts House, where we took over the porch. And then, of course, we activated the lawn and the surrounding area with Caribbean programming. And to the right, you'll see some of the ways that we extend our reach online through relationships like the one we have with Google Arts. So this is our Life with Basquiat exhibition that debuted at the Brooklyn Museum and is now on view globally via Google Arts. Next slide, please. So, the purpose of our work, really a lot of it is very place-based. For those of you who do not know, since the 1960s, Caribbean immigrants have been immigrating from the region, with a lot of them calling Flatbush their home. Of course, there are populations elsewhere like Queens, where there's a large Indo-Caribbean population from both Trinidad and Guyana, in the Bronx, Little Dominican Republic, Uptown, which we also were involved with, as well as Staten Island. So if we can just play this video, you could see sort of some of our work on the ground in the neighborhood. So since we're talking about preservation, I think it's really important to note that 2 of the businesses that you saw there are no longer in operation. So Rain Eatery has since closed, as did Cream and Cocoa. So really, in terms of the work that we do centering not only Caribbean communities, but also commerce, is really, really central to the sustainability of, I believe, not only Brooklyn, but also New York City. Next slide, please. Here, again, is, more of our on the ground work. So to the far left, you'll see our Best of Little Caribbean Awards, our One Love Fest, and to the right, culminating, the summer culminates with the our activation on the West Indian American Day Parade. This is some of the programming that tends to kick off in June, which is National Caribbean American Heritage Month. Next slide. So we also lead walking tours in Brooklyn. I'm happy to announce that we were tapped by National Geographic to launch the very first and only tour at the moment in Brooklyn, New York, after a very successful pilot. We've also created this Little Caribbean passport and have hosted at James Beard dinners, as well as curated Taste of Little Caribbean for Kathy Hochul. And then to the far right is our new headquarters. So you'll see pictured the Deputy Commissioner of Small Business Services, CEO of Brooklyn Chamber, Randy Piers, and Jamani Williams, the public advocate, who's also Caribbean American. Next slide. And then, of course, we activate public space with culturally responsive programming. Here you'll see our upcycled shipping container, which is part of our sustainability initiatives. This is currently stationed on Governor's Island for the season. We're an organization in residence for the second year in a row, excuse me. And this is when it was stationed right outside of Prospect Park. We were most recently tapped by the New York City Department of Transportation to lead Earth Day activities, as well as a year-long public art intervention on a new plaza that's right south of Prospect Park and Brooklyn Botanic. And we were just approved for open streets on Bob Marley Boulevard. So as we talk about the importance of co-naming streets after the community that resides there, we're really happy about that particular award or news. Is that it? Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, do we have Pete Nice?
Hey, nice to be here with all of you today. I'm Pete Nice. My background started my life in hip hop as an MC back in the 80s. I was in a group in the late 80s and 90s called Third Base on Def Jam Recordings. I grew up in Brooklyn, Queens, Long Island, ended up going to college at Columbia and graduated in Columbia 1989. And when I graduated, told my mother that I was not getting a job, that I was going to release a record and signed a record contract. So she was not too thrilled about that. But when she saw me on Arsenio Hall a couple of months later, she was basically bragging to all her friends. So I made it out. But I also made it to this situation in my life many years after, the crux of my career as an MC, to be involved with the new hip hop museum, which has been being built in the Bronx pretty much for the last decade. Our executive director, Rocky Bucano, and a whole team of people have been working on this concept for over a decade, and it has now come to fruition. The building is constructed in Bronx next to the 149th Street Bridge and is planned to open in the fall of 2025. And we have the awesome responsibility of documenting, preserving, and capturing and basically telling the story of all the pioneers who created hip hop, put the foundation on their shoulders. And as we look at this first slide, this is a photograph, original Polaroid of Kool Herc, who many of us know is considered, the forefather or godfather of hip hop. This is him at the Hevelo Club on Jerome Avenue, right around 1975. The early days of hip hop, there's lots of folklore. And, when you look at the entire history of New York City going back hundreds of years, we're dealing with a culture that, really took hold from the early 1970s through the current day. So in the bigger picture, it's, a very new movement. And, we're able to actually have people like Kool Herc still with us, and we're able to interview them. We're able to go through their archives and, acquire items for the museum that tell their story. This photograph was Herc's, which he saved, and some other members of his family, his brother Kenny, also a bit of a family archivist himself, had his own collection. So, thanks to them, some of these, great relics to tell their stories are here. And, the Hip Hop Museum, we're able to go out into the actual communities, in this particular case, West Bronx, and try to find out what the story is. Other practitioners of hip hop, one in particular, Phase 2, who was one of the greatest aerosol writers in history and b-boy, basically all the elements of hip hop he covered. Rest in peace, my boy Faye. But he was really also one of the first true historians of hip hop, and he would always tell stories about a DJ named DJ John Brown, who was Kool Herc's classmate in high school at Alfred E. Smith. And I'll just go to the next slide right here. So the story is, and like I said, hip hop is filled with folklore. One of our missions as a museum is to cut through a lot of the myths and get into more of the factual analysis of the history of hip hop. And everyone looks at August 11th, 1973 as the birthday of hip hop. And myself as a curator, and a curator along with Paradise Gray, who is the chief curator, we know that that's not the case, that a movement and a culture like hip hop was not formed in one day. It basically evolved. And when you look at the actual date that was picked out, the actual evidence, even directly from, is in contrast to that, because here we have parties that Kool Herc was involved in 1972. So is hip hop 50? Is it 51? Is it 52? The first card is from 1972. You see his actual tag because he was a writer. He did involved in the early graffiti movement. The second one is from 1520 Sedgwick, later in the fall of 1973. So these are, actual documents which we're able to go into the community, to the practitioners, and, protect them and, hold them out there for our community in the Bronx, but also to the worldwide community, because, hip hop has really, stretched out internationally, to levels, and even in the recording industry and the rap music industry, to even take it further than even being the subculture that it started out as. Next slide. So back to Phase 2, and in getting these oral histories, we hear stories about people that we never knew about before, and one of those people was DJ John Brown. Phase 2 told me that DJ John Brown was an early DJ at a club called the Plaza Tunnel, which was in the basement of the Grand Concourse Hotel on the Grand Concourse across from Yankee Stadium. And he said that was the place where John Brown would play particular records, focus on records that had breaks, funky records that Faze and other guys like Bosco and Wallace D, Disco King Mario, and some of the Black Spades would actually up rock and do some of the, quote unquote, new dance moves that were the ceilings of breaking. And John Brown was that guy who provided, that platform. He was also a classmate of Kool Herc's. Herc went to these parties. Another DJ from that point, DJ Smokey, went to these parties. So we have the opportunity with the Hip Hop Museum to actually try to track down people like DJ John Brown. No one knew where he was. I got one of these people finder applications, and a guy named Midas, who just released his book, The Birth of Breaking, had found John Brown's picture in his high school yearbook, and it was John D. Brown III. With that information, we were able to actually track him down. He lived in the same neighborhood in High Bridge, right in our backyard, right in his own backyard that he'd been in all these years. He's in his 70s. And we were able to interview John. This Polaroid is John Brown at the Plaza Tunnel in 1971. So he spun at the Plaza Tunnel from 1971 till it closed in 1973. And, this is the greatest evidence of, the myths that we heard and the stories from Phase 2. Next slide, please. Now, because we're able to reach out, there's so many friends and legends that we lost, like Biz Markie, DMX, Scott LaRock, Jam Master Jay, that many and the majority of the practitioners of hip hop are still alive and with us, and we're able to speak to them and do these oral histories. In this case, John Brown wrote down some of his own story and gave some kind of mind-blowing background as to, you know, how much there is that we don't know about the origins of hip hop. The first photo was Kool Herc at the Hevelo, and it turns out that after John Brown left the Plaza Tunnel, the bartender at the Plaza Tunnel opened up the club called the Hevelo, and John Brown was the first DJ at the Hevelo before Kool Herc. So, you know, John Brown talks about how he started and, you know, really what his place in hip hop is. He refers to himself as the missing link that no one really knows about. And luckily we're able, you know, through the Hip Hop Museum and this new entity, we're able to tell his story and the early story of hip hop. Next slide. Now this is the actual evidence. Like, hip hop is based so much on music. Sorry, I have a little noise problem here. Music is the basis of, you know, hip hop, and the DJ is the center of that, and, you know, the most critical element that gave rise to all the rest. And however, the early documentation and sound of those parties is almost impossible to find. And through Kool Herc's brother, who preserved this tape for many, many decades, this is a actual cassette tape, a Maxell tape that was manufactured in 1977 of 45 minutes of a Kool Herc jam at the Executive Playhouse in 1977. And you can hear Kool Herc on the mic, shouting out certain people in the early, like, talking method that, you know, some of the earliest MCs would entertain the crowd with. And you hear all the foundational breaks, the James Browns, the Baby Hueys, the Jimmy Casters. And I mean, it really takes you back, captures that moment. And, you know, the only reason we were able to have this evidence is reaching out to the people in the community. So we're hoping that, you know, as the museum opens in 2025, that, you know, we'll be able to further connect to so many different people that have their own stories and kind of, you know, show the rich culture of hip hop, where it came from and where it's going in the future.
All right, thank you, Pete.
You're welcome.
Next up, we have Delma Palma from the Empire State Corporation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Delma Palma, and I'm an architect and planner, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about my past work at the New York City Housing Authority and some current work at Empire State Development. So my work at NYCHA was focused on participatory design at the public realm. So the idea of people and place was directly embodied here, where folks had established a deep community in public housing, but they also have quite complex relationship with the place itself. So the buildings, as many of you probably know if you've walked around New York City, they're in need of significant capital investment. And so they're also a symbol of the institution and decades-long disinvestment from many levels of government. But they're also people's homes, and they're the backdrop to a lot of joy and creativity. So there, the concept of preservation was mostly about the physical buildings and preserving this much needed affordable housing asset in New York City. And perhaps not enough focus was on the cultural heritage of the communities that live there. So the work I did while at NYCHA, the Connected Communities program, it focused on engaging communities in the design and activation of culturally relevant spaces. You know, whether that was through the renovation of historical artwork or the creation of new artwork, oral history projects, or spaces for health and wellness. So the funding of this work always had to be, and I believe continues to be, somewhat innovative and done in many types of partnerships, because it wasn't necessarily an urgent need for the available capital funding. I think the field of preservation can and should expand to focus more on the lived experience of public housing communities, because this experience can sometimes be, you know, a temporary stay or a long stay in a place that has this very complicated relationship with the idea of property ownership, the influence of time on culture, and the necessary stability and maintenance of this public asset. So if we go to the next slide, I'll speak to my work at the state level, which is also focused on housing New Yorkers and improving the public realm. but through construction of new housing and underutilized state-owned land. So we have several vacant state-owned prisons and psychiatric centers that are in the process of being converted to housing. So we enable this through land entitlement, community engagement, and sometimes financing. The project that you see here is Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens, where ESD has developed a community master plan for over 50 acres of vacant land and vacant buildings that are on site to add affordable and supportive housing of different typologies. We often discuss preservation for these types of real estate projects, mostly in terms of historic tax credits, and that very strict preservation approach that is required for, that particular funding mechanism. But as we all know, if we're trying to solve the housing crisis and the climate crisis simultaneously, then retrofitting structures, existing structures, is not always financially viable without partial, significant changes to the structure of these buildings. So expanding the concept and the funding opportunities for partial historic preservation projects, and again, including funding for memorializing the cultural heritage of a place in other ways is paramount to actually getting these types of projects built. We've heard from the speakers today what types of projects and programs can be incorporated. So for a place like Creedmoor that went from farm to psychiatric center to what will hopefully be a thriving neighborhood, there are many opportunities to honor the history of the people in place. Oftentimes the new neighborhoods that are getting built, they lack the authenticity that many of us like about older places. And I think if developers had an incentive to incorporate cultural heritage that superseded what they have now, then these new places would be places that are more culturally appropriate, interesting, and contextual. So thank you.
Thank you, Delma. And now we've got our last speaker, Kamau, Ware, the Black Gotham Experience.
Hello. Can everybody hear me all right? All right, cool. I want to definitely initially just say shout out to everybody who's already presented. It's been great just to listen and hear about all the amazing things that people are doing. My name is Kamau. Black Gotham Experience was created by my commercial studio, which is story style. It's a focus. We focus on stories. Photography is a big part of my work and my approach to storytelling. So you'll notice that I'm going to present with you a digital comic book called Buffalo Sonnet that definitely is photography based, but there's a lot of ways to braid history into it, but also some spirituality, which sometimes is like a no-no. You're not supposed to talk about spirit because it can get weird, right? But actually Buffalo Sonnet is a prayer. It is a 14-line prayer for people of African descent in New York City that have been displaced. And that comes out of our research and history that goes back to the 15th century, looking at how people of African descent initially began to arrive in this territory and how they had been able to alchemize pain and alchemize oppression and find ways of resiliency and to hold space. One of the oldest communities in this territory are people of African descent going back to the early 1600s. And so Buffalo Sonnet jumps in the early 1900s. The actual setting for the story is 1922. And so I'm going to walk you through this digital comic book, not the entire thing, but it is accessible on your phone. So I'm sure there'll be a link that'll be put in the chat. You can actually download it. It's about a 22-minute or so read, but this entire ethos of how do we tell stories, engaging people to play characters so they're archiving stories while also archiving their own life has been a methodology established by Black Gotham Experience, and we turned 14 this August. I'm sorry, next slide, please. And so this just gives you like a sense, the red square, this is looking from looking from the northern perspective down to southern Manhattan. If you go to where Lincoln's Center is now, that area was more or less where the San Juan Hill neighborhood was. And just here is like a little clip about somebody, throwing water on like an Italian boy and how it turns into like this entire skirmish. If you've ever heard of the story, West Side Story, that is a way of understanding the location, but part of which you don't have in that play or in those movies is the representation of people of African descent. But San Juan Hill, turn of the century, was one of the largest Black communities in Manhattan. And there isn't a single scholarly book about San Juan Hill. San Juan Hill shows up in different scholarship about Black people in New York as a whole, but this small community really was instrumental in establishing different forms of arts and culture. The Amsterdam News, one of the oldest Black newspapers in the country, used to be on Amsterdam Avenue, which is in San Juan Hill. So there's a lot about this neighborhood. We wanted to do research and just kind of bring that into a comic book. That is also a prayer as a way of offering some insight, but also some medicine, some healing, some things for people to contemplate when you understand how force and how violence has been a consistent way of moving Black bodies from community to community. We go to the next slide. And so part of what we did was use a range of photographic imagery. This is two different sections side by side. The actual digital comic book is one vertical panel. And we asked people to step in and cast them and dress them in characters that would have been existed in the 1920s. Some of them are historic figures that actually did exist. Some of them are characters that were created. And for me as a writer, illustrator, I had a chance to like think about what's taking place in every aspect, but I had a great team to work with as well. One of the slides I usually show when I talk about Buffalo Sonnet, when I have a little time, just shows you the entire group of people that I work with, from people like Issa Reyes, my man, Justice Wade, Adrian, Pope, Phoenix, consultant like Chris Walker. We had like about 12 or so people just on the creative side, plus we had talent that came in to play some of the characters. And we used images that were archival, plus that were more contemporary to make this collage with this treatment. So people get a chance to walk into a space that really is documented, but you don't really have a lot of documentation of like the day-to-day life that tells you the kind of stories that I wanted to share. And so if we go to the next slide, you'll see another example of it. Part of what you did have in San Juan Hill is you did have some tension. And when I talk about tension, it wasn't the only way of understanding San Juan Hill, but there was a certain degree of, you know, Italian people, Irish people, kind of around Black community, and how this is like the 1920s. There's lots of lynchings taking place in the city, well, not in the city, but in the country. There's a lot of different types of race riots that are happening. This is like around the same time that Black people and white people are forming the NAACP to address all these different forms of violence. That is like the crisis, which is the actual name of the newspaper that W.E.B. Du Bois was the editor for. And so this is a neighborhood where Black people have been pushed out from Lower Manhattan, Little Africa, Seneca Village, all these different places that Black people held space. And so there's a character named Copper, who's played by a guy named Ryan, who is more or less telling this youngster named Paint, who lives in San Juan Hill, that he has to be more tough. He has to be more ready to fight at any point in time to protect his place in the neighborhood. But all Paint wants to do is learn how to play piano. And he's really intrigued by this new play in the neighborhood called Shuffle Along, which is the first Black written, Black casted Broadway hit in the history of this country. And this is also the same time period that there's other luminaries that are coming to San Juan Hill that we wanted to like give that as a slice of life, a snapshot of taking these historic figures plus these fictional characters and give you a day in the life of San Juan. You can go to the next one. And so just like and more or less like a way of closing out is there's an image here to the left. You see the treatment over here on the right. And this is the mission of Black Gotham Experience. And in many respects, the last two words tells you everything. Remember together. How do we find a way to reclaim what's often redacted, often made obscure, often intentionally hidden, often not in front of your face when you're in these spaces that have these layers of history. San Juan Hill was an example of a neighborhood that was a predominant Black community, or one of the largest Black communities, but it's not there anymore. Lincoln Center commissioned this project. They're intentional about finding ways to excavate this memory that was there. But there's other parts of New York City as well that you have no idea that there was all this Black history. And New York City really is a historic Black space. It's not something that just is added to this territory. The actual original intention of New York City was to be a part of a slave trading enterprise by the royals, King Charles II and his little brother James Stewart, Duke of York. But most people don't understand that before there was a New York, there was already a Black community here. And so our goal is to find ways to engage people primarily through taking walks through the city. 14 years in, we now have about 15 or so different unique experiences that you can do either through walking through the city or through film or through audio programs. We've had a chance to work with a number of great organizations. And our goal is to just widen that opportunity. And every time we do a project that is going to involve visualization like this, we are able to reach out to people and ask them to step in and play a character like this person here, Tan Parker, who was playing the role of Catalina Anthony, who was the Black landowner circa July 13th, 1643. And so this story of San Juan Hill as a digital comic can reach a lot of audiences. For me as an inner child, like Kamau Studios, there's a lot of ways for me to play and use photography and writing and comics to do what I love to do, which is create, but also tell stories. But also as I've gotten older, I've just seen the need for history, a need for people to have context for where they are. And also at the same time, I've seen there to be a need for some spiritual awareness, some sense of wellness. And as we've taken all these walks throughout the city over the past 13, almost 14 years, we've seen walking as a spiritual exercise. And a lot of different Indigenous communities find it that way as well. And so even though we have all this technology to create these comic books, at the foundation, it's like, get outside, take a walk, ask where you are, ask some questions. And I think about the different people who presented before I did. That's a continuity that we have. I'm hearing about people walking, collecting history, and sharing that, yes, as a form of preservation, but also as a form of cultural expression that is joyful. And so digging into the past is not something that necessarily makes you feel upset or sad. It just gives you context and allows you to be right there at the fulcrum of understanding. And so I appreciate being able to share with everybody else and look forward to the conversation to continue.
So before we head into our moderated Q&A session, we are going to have Zara return to us and share a bit of the graphic capture up to this point.
Okay, so one thing that I've been thinking about as I've been capturing here is hearing everyone's feedback and storytelling and work. I'm centering it around the question of, or the statement, preservation is. So you see that in the center here. And, you know, this is really going to be kind of all of the comments and materials that I've been hearing is centered around that statement. So you see things like up here in the top left corner, some of what Pete shared around how using the community to find more history and protecting the physical documents is really something that that preservation means to his work. We also just heard through multiple people how important the built environment is, not only in museums and how we name things, but specifically in how we design it, or you know, how it is accessible or remembered when we think about the climate crisis, or not even remembered, but as Kamau was just talking about, how it's something to educate others on through innovative storytelling. So here are some of the things I've been hearing. I'm excited to continue to organize and draw out these themes as we go into the Q&A part of the conversation. So this will look a little different the next time we come back together to see it. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Amanda, and stop sharing.
That was very cool. Thank you so much. So first, I have my own set of questions that I'm going to ask our panelists to get the conversation going, but I want to remind each of you that you can submit a question for us to answer. So please continue to do that as we speak, as we field questions and offer you some answers. So I actually want to start with Faye Yuan. First, I would love to hear you talk a bit more about how participatory archiving differs from traditional notions of archiving, but also, you know, Queens is vast, but also one of the most diverse counties in the US, right? And so how do you decide, how do you curate something that has so much material, right? How do you decide, okay, this can stay, this is not going to make it in, right? So how do you make those critical decisions?
Yeah, so I'll start with the first part because I think they're connected. So I'm just going to give an example to kind of make it clear. For the Name Explore project, we call it a participatory archiving initiative because it is truly participatory. I think the most participatory of its kind out of all of our archiving initiatives. And I think it's different from a traditional archive because it has this data set layer that is different. So the Queen's Name Explorer actually pulls in a data set from open source data of like 1,200 different named places in Queens. And before the Name Explorer existed, I should mention that these data sets existed in different siloed places. And I think when we started the project, we wanted to bring it all together. And so the data set is very dynamic because if you think about it, if you're someone like me and you're walking across the street and you look up and there's a street name. Now you might, if you live in the neighborhood long enough, you might remember who that person is. But if you're new to the neighborhood, you might not. And not to mention, there are new street signs, new street names that are being changed and reco-named every year here in New York City, not just in Queens, but all over the city. And so keeping that data set sort of updated and keeping it also like the daily upkeep required to keep it rigorous, I think is really, it's challenging. And I think it's an opportunity for us to think about how do we make this a community archive truly reflect the community presence, truly reflect all the changes that are already happening in our built environment. I think the second thing that makes it different from traditional archives is that it requires sort of like a different level of engagement with our communities. And so recently, I'll bring up another example. During New York City Open Data Week, we partnered with Wikimedia, OpenStreetMap, and Urban Archive to create sort of like an edit-thon. So the idea is that all of these named place entries on our map, they might show up on the map or in local newspapers, but they don't have a Wikipedia entry, for example, or they don't show up on OpenStreetMap. So we wanted to correct that. And so we, brought together our partners and we convened in a library location in Long Island City. And we wanted to bridge this gap between the local history community and the open data community by bringing them together. And so we train people on how to edit and create new entries in Wikipedia. And so that's in a way kind of like spotlighting dynamic local heroes, but giving them an international platform. So I think that those two are like things that I think are unique to the Name Explore project and to the whole participatory archiving model. And as far as curation, I feel like for Name Explore, what I most do in terms of my curating is really like doing that community outreach and thinking about community outreach in sort of like a more long-term way. So instead of thinking about, okay, here we have this community event, how do we get the word out as kind of like a one-off basis? I think I give it a much longer time frame because we are involved with this project we will be involved with this project for 5, 10, 15 years from now. So I think about the outreach and engagement piece on a much longer timeline as well, while giving ourselves and our librarians and archivists permission to kind of like slow down and reflect on this collection process as we're in the process of collecting, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Faye. I'm actually going to ask all of our panelists to turn the cameras on as we continue with this moderated question and answer part. Thank you. So my next question, I'm actually going to take us to the Bronx. Pete Nice, we just got off of the huge 50th anniversary celebrations of hip hop. Hip hop is probably the US's greatest cultural export since, the last 50 years, and everyone feels such ownership over hip hop culture and its many permutations, right? And so I'd love to hear you talk about some of the decision making that goes into, creating a hip hop museum. Some of those decisions about, well, who makes the decisions? Who do you do that sort of outreach to, especially in light of the fact that, as you mentioned, so many of hip hop's founders and architects are still with us.
Exactly. And, there's so many arguments within hip hop. You have just the issue between the different boroughs, what happened in Brooklyn, what happened in Queens, what happened in the Bronx, what happened in different parts of the Bronx. Like, did things start in Soundview with Disco King Mario, with Herc in the West Bronx, or, you know, with Mean Gene and Grandmaster Flash in another neighborhood. So there's all of that controversy, all the argument, which is great, because with that argument comes out the true history. And, you know, when we go and come up with the narrative of hip hop, how hip hop started and how it extended into the present, we've tried to include, you know, many other historians, you know, practitioners themselves, you know, cultural ambassadors of hip hop, who also journalists, you know, some of the important collections. Like hip hop got a much more scholarly platform with Cornell University acquiring a couple of collections, one in particular, the Bill Adler collection. Bill was my publicist at Def Jam and was a great, you know, historian and documenter of the culture. And, you know, that's one of the ways that we establish this. We're the Hip Hop Museum. Our tagline is the official record of hip hop. So in order to have that record be accurate, you know, we're engaging all of the major players, and not just in New York, because, you know, hip hop got so regional. And when you go out into Texas, we go into Houston, we go to Atlanta, we go to Oakland and LA, and overseas to, you know, in 1982, there was the New York City rap tour to Paris and London. And then Charlie Ahern, who is another person we go to who has assisted, brings the first groups to Japan, and you see how hip hop has just taken off in Japan. I mean, there are a lot of Japanese fans and, you know, aficionados who are more knowledgeable even on some of the things that happened in the Bronx in the early 70s, because they're that dedicated to the history. So, you know, for the most part, it's a big responsibility. So, you know, we're really trying to include and be inclusive for, you know, as many as those voices to, you know, make sure that things are correct.
Thank you. I'm going to actually turn to Delma now. Delma, the work that you do to center equity-focused planning, especially in historically disinvested and under-resourced communities, is really essential, especially at this sort of juncture in the city's rapidly changing history. And I would love to hear you talk a bit about how, so basically at MAS, we're very interested in, you know, again, equity-focused development that takes cultural heritage in consideration. So how do you channel these sort of well-meaning guidelines and these incredibly progressive intentions with actionable steps, right? How are you actually translating these into incentives for developers? Do you have any examples of where that's been done well? And advice for folks who really want to make this kind of equity work and development actionable?
Yeah, so I'll start with my prior work, which was in public housing. I think we need to see significant investment in public housing and the preservation and improvement of public housing to incorporate this cultural heritage work, because that is a permanently affordable asset that will continue to serve New Yorkers for generations. So in that piece now on my work in public-private partnerships on the state level, you know, we're constantly advocating for similar things, mostly on the new construction side. And I think an example that I'll mention that actually NYCHA did was Stonewall House. It's new construction in Fort Greene, right? Which it's 100% affordable housing. It's for seniors and in support of the LGBTQ community. And so things that like that are addressing, you know, needs that you're seeing, and not just for affordable housing, but a very specific type of housing is something that looks at the broader community and what is needed. The Connected Communities program, which I want to give a shout out to Videhi Modi. I think she's on the call and currently leads that at NYCHA. It looks at really innovative funding structures, right? I think that we have to really understand how these projects are financed in order to be able to incorporate some of these things. And oftentimes what we hear is that there isn't funding for some of these programs. And so finding ways that to make that a reality on the public partnership side, or even on the public side, which Vijay he's working on through a lot of foundation work and different types of partnerships. Also supporting parties that have the public interest in mind. So that's typically your public servants, your government institutions, or your advocacy organizations, supporting them in their efforts to help either do development or influence real estate development in some way. So at the state, we're working a lot with nonprofit developers and trying to take away some of the risk of nonprofit developers doing real estate development at potentially like a bigger scale than they would otherwise be able to do.
Thank you. My next question is for Kamau. Your work is distinct among the panelists in the way that you oftentimes dig very far into the distant past, right, to sort of uncover and tie, make linkages to living histories that are still unfolding around us. And so can you speak to how that practice of yours, again, like re-earthing or unearthing and reanimating histories from the distant past, gives you maybe a distinctive vantage point to sort of contemporary conversations and practices around preservation?
Yeah, so that's a lovely nerdy question there. I think that like context is so critical. There's a reason why human beings love telling stories. Our days are stories, our lives are stories. It is a way for us to understand other people's experience as well, not just beginning, middle, and end, but just like from a character standpoint, like who a person is. And the actual inspiration in many respects for Black Gotham experience comes from like just a child's curiosity. It was like 2008 when I was working at the Tenement Museum in the Lower East Side, that a child asked me after 90 minutes of talking about German, Jewish, and Italian history, some young Black girl from Brooklyn was like, where's the Black people at? And I think that kind of curiosity of a child really applies to adults too. And I began to like find out that there were more and more adults that had those kind of similar questions, but they suppress it. And so we really suppress a lot in order for us to participate in society. But then when you realize that some of that healing work of excavating the context of who you are just opens up a lot of ways of understanding the world, and the past is very present. Some of the first people that were worked for a company, like there were quote unquote company slaves here building streets that still exist, whether it be like Broadway, Wall Street, Bowery. The people of African descent that were here in the 1620s, 30s, 40s, 50s have built public works that still exist right now. And they were negotiating. You know, everybody wasn't able to like, you know, get a salary or get paid, but there were people of African descent that were getting wages during this time of enslavement, during this window in history between 1624 and 1664. And so most people would not think that some of the rights that laborers get to this day connects back to people who were enslaved to a company, were able to negotiate collectively and bargain. And so there's so many things about the world that we live in, even like, you know, private ownership, where religion comes in. It just gives you a vantage point of understanding yourself as a character. You know, we're all historic figures, and part of our process of asking people to step in and play these historic figures allows them to activate their human archive. Because like, if we talk about archives and all these histories, part of why I'm enjoying this conversation is because it's a very simple thing to consider, but the deepest archive we have is ourselves. We're such ancient creatures, and the things that we collect that tell our stories now come from all types of things that we've inherited from our ancestors. And so I think people who get a chance to walk around New York and recontextualize where they are and who they are just gives them an opportunity to, you know, put that next foot in front of them with a little bit more, you know, ashe, a little more affirmation. And that's the best medicine, is for everybody to get a chance to just raise their vibration. And it's not just information. It's information, it's walking, it's talking, it's meditation, but walking and learning is a big part of it.
Thank you. And before we turn to the audience for questions, I'll close with a question for Shelley. I'm definitely a Brooklyn-centered person, so I definitely appreciate the work that you're doing in Flatbush and Little Caribbean. And I'm wondering if you can share with us a bit more about your approach to, showcasing the beauty of Caribbean culture, from, your expertise having worked in hospitality. So sharing more about your specific approach, but also balancing that and just the beauty again and the necessity of showing the world how incredible Caribbean culture is, balancing that with some of the pressures around gentrification and wanting to ensure that the very people whose culture you're showcasing are able to stay in the community and reap the benefits of this external awareness and attention.
Yeah, so just first off, like my background is in media and tech. So a lot of what I do, as you saw in the work with Google Arts, for example, and even if you think about some of the work we do with museums is around storytelling and how do we actually leverage larger platforms to disseminate content and programming that represents this very significant community that calls not only Flatbush, but New York City and the United States home. So for us, really, I borrowed a lot from my background in corporate America, sort of like working in media and tech, briefly in hospitality, but I spent a lot more time working in that field. And, really just tapping into the resources and assets, not only here, in Flatbush and Brooklyn, but across the entire diaspora, as well as like, how do you connect that to back home, right? Because there has to be this like connection to other diaspora communities, but also to the region itself, like the place from which these people came. So for me, initially it was really about taking that programming to the streets. So we started off as a film festival. A lot of our projections were actually on the streets. Like we used to project films on the corner of Flatbush and Church Avenue, right on the steps of the Dutch Reformed Church. And then, we sort of did some projections as well in local libraries. So it's really, we started off with like taking up space and how do we have these institutions actually have programming and content, as well as the streets of New York, the neighborhoods, and other sort of like partners that we developed over time. How do they represent this portion of the community, right? And in a very meaningful way, not in a performative kind of way that's very passive. And so one example of that is the relationship we have with Link NYC. So when we started off with our Caribbean American Icon series quite a few years ago, they wanted that to be geo-targeted just to neighborhoods in Brooklyn, right? Like maybe 2 or 3 zip codes, or maybe it was 5, I don't remember. But we were able to quickly justify to them that, there are actually people living in other neighborhoods that are of Caribbean descent, but also we're moving throughout the city. So why can't we be, on a kiosk on Times Square or on a kiosk, in Lower Manhattan, on Wall Street and elsewhere. And we were able to make that case. And now, that's become an annual campaign. So it's really about not only presenting the work and sort of getting the work into places, whether they're public or private, but also then supporting that with data-driven metrics, right? So that you can sustain that work. I personally do not have any control over gentrification and displacement, and we're definitely feeling it, down in Flatbush, Brooklyn, just like we are elsewhere. But what I can say is that through our work, we are seeking to preserve the culture and the community, as well as the commerce, the small businesses that have been living there for many, many decades.
Thank you all. So now we're going to turn to some of our excellent questions from our audience. And please remember, you can still submit your questions in the chat. So up first, an attendee has asked Pete to talk about how the community was able to convince the city to include the Hip Hop Museum in a Bronx housing project. Sorry, Pete, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So our executive director, Rocky Bucano, him and a small group of founders of the museum were searching out for different locations at the old Bronx courthouse was one of the actual locations that was slated for the museum. All of those fell through, and a building project at the Bronx Point with, I believe it was L&M Partners. You know, one of the developers got together with Rocky and just pitched the idea of possibly including the museum project within their affordable housing, you know, complex and plan. And, you know, other local community leaders and, you know, politicians as well, you know, basically backed it. And, you know, the museum has gotten a lot of financial support, you know, from the city and from the state and from the Bronx itself and the borough. And, you know, that's pretty much how it all came together. It was like a lot of different moving pieces, but it was that initial tie-in to the development group that was refurbishing Bronx Point and, you know, building this complex that gave us the opportunity to have the perfect spot where, you know, in other cases, this museum might not exist in another 5 years if we didn't have that, because, you know, there definitely were some false alarms, so to speak, on, you know, different locations that looked like they were going to work and then didn't. So, I mean, hip hop is over 50 years old. There's never been, you know, one single institution, you know, to document and preserve that history. So, I mean, it's the right time. Personally, I think it should have been 20 years ago, but, you know, things happen for a reason, and there's a reason why it's in the Bronx as well. So in the end, I think it all, you know, came off and went on plan.
Thank you. Another anonymous attendee has asked, how can the field of preservation be expanded to better support your work? And I want to open the floor for any of the panelists who can answer that.
I'll jump in. This is my second time being a part of a MAS panel. The first one was in person at a beautiful church, I think on Park Avenue. I might be having the wrong, I don't want to get the name wrong. But I feel like a similar question came up. And so I think that there's a through line here. And I think that preservation should be expanded. I think that if you look at the way preservation hit certain milestones in the 20th century, it's when something that was designated too old or significant. I think it was the Penn Station building in particular that they really began to organize and say, we destroyed a very incredible building in order to make something new, but the new thing isn't necessarily always better. I think that looking at the layers of the urban space allows us to like make a choice. Are we only looking at preserving a particular layer, or how do we find ways to acknowledge all the layers, which is in part why walking experiences are so useful, because you're not looking at just what's in front of you. You can look and remember what else was there. And so in many respects, ways to like walk around and acknowledge what was once there is a form of preservation. I think that could be augmented with things like street names or technology, but I think that preservation should not stop at one person's perspective about a building, but there's things below the ground that also need to be brought to mind when you're standing in certain places.
Just to build off of that, I think that there's a very systematic way that we go about preserving physical buildings. And I don't know if it's because I'm not an expert, but I don't know if that same thing exists for cultural heritage. And so if, you know, not to create another process, but like if there was a clear way of documenting and sort of systematically preserving that in different neighborhoods, I think perhaps there would be more accessibility to understand how it was done, just like there is for funding, for funding and process for buildings. So that, I mean, coming from an architect, I think that's also why I gravitate towards some sort of process like that. But if it could be expanded to incorporate some of that, I think it would really help clarify.
Yeah, I would just add to that, you know, sometimes when I think about preservation, it tends to be very visual, like thinking about our visual landscapes and what's right in front of us. So kind of prioritizing what's seen. But I think it's equally important to think and talk about what we hear. In other words, like the sonic landscapes, like what's in the natural ecological wild sounds of our neighborhoods and our communities. And I know that this is something that we're very interested in here at Queen's Memory, is kind of provide better documentation of our sonic landscapes. And we do walking tours, but can we also record just like the wild natural sounds of our immediate environments before they disappear or before they change?
Thank you. I actually want to ask one of my own questions, and I'd love again for any of you who feel moved to answer can certainly answer. I think that also oftentimes when we talk about preservation, we have to talk about sort of the erasure, the displacement, the loss, marginalization, all the kind of negative things that create a need for preservation. And so I'd love to actually hear you talk about what brings you joy or hope that you're seeing in the work that you're doing now about the future of the communities and cultural heritage that you're working to preserve.
I guess I could speak to that a bit, like in terms of, hip hop history in general. A lot of the founders and creators of hip hop never got a piece of the financial business side of hip hop, and a lot of them who, really put in the work every weekend for years, really for the love of it and for the passion that they had for emceeing, DJing, dancing, on all the party flyers, throughout those years, 1977 through the early 80s. For them to actually get that recognition that they never got. And you might see the Furious Five and Melly Mel and Grandmaster Flash get the accolades in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but there are 25 other groups and crews that were around doing their thing right at the same time and played a very important part. So, to be able to reach out and tell their stories, give them the recognition, not that it's financial and that they're not getting a royalty check from a big record company or a TV network, but the fact that they contributed is actually part of, the official record at this point.
I'm inspired a lot by what I see young people doing. We've been working with like thousands of students, dozens of schools. I have a background in education. We have a bunch of students coming from DC in a couple of days. And when you talk to young people about storytelling, you talk about history that's been redacted, they don't have a lot of unlearning to do. They just get it. And I think about that, just that like cohort of like middle school students that I've been working with in many respects since 2008. They're not just ready, they're just like been ready, and I think that children are not just the future. Children at any given moment are just a great way for us to just challenge what we think we understand so well. And so when I see young people asking those amazing questions and getting those things quickly, like I often present youngsters with texts that I presented to like college students that I taught at the new school as a visiting fellow. And I take the exact same language and I put it in front of a second grader, fourth grader, or an eighth grader. And the things that I hear them understand, the complexity of thought that they're working with is consistently inspiring, because as long as we're here and we have children, we have these opportunities to not just invest in them, but also to like listen to them and allow them to also have an impact on us. And I think that's one of the big things about, once again, expanding preservation. I think part of preservation is also like not just spaces, but also like those institutions that we hold as human beings. And childhood and inner child work is a really important part of our well-being. And so a lot of you think about hip hop. I mean, I was in middle school here, listening to third base, you know what I'm saying? And so, I mean, hip hop was something that I like took to when I was first heard it. I remember I was Rakim's, paid in full. I recorded on a tape, I was in Pittsburgh going to Rising Sign. And I think a lot of people, hip hop for them was like a thing you did as a kid. Very few people like just like jump in at 25 and say, I'm gonna start this out. A lot of people say grew up hearing it, playing, dancing, and that also I think is a form of preservation, is allowing us to have that like joy of play and access. And I get inspired when I see people who are joyful playing, but also they sharp, and I think that's what gives me a degree of hope.
Thank you so much. We've only got a few short minutes before our closing remarks, so I just wanted to give each of our panelists an opportunity to maybe share an upcoming project that we should be on the lookout for, or an event you have coming up.
Yeah, I can start. So we are just a few days away from National Caribbean American Heritage Month, which is when I should say rather, sort of our peak, what we call peak programming sort of starts for our organization. So we have a ton of stuff going on this summer, starting with the James Beard Dinner on June 1st. And then we move into the Best of Little Caribbean Awards, which will be at the Boathouse, of One Love Fest. I can drop some of the links in the chat, but we're pretty busy this summer with programming and community engagement.
Yeah, my answer kind of ties into your last question too, Amanda. So plugging an upcoming project. So as I said in my presentation, a new season of the Queen's Memory podcast is going to come out next year, 2025, and that'll be season 4, which is all about climate related issues in Queens, but also like affecting everyday New Yorkers. And one thing that really excites me about talking about climate change is this kind of old climate slogan that we think globally but act locally. So like climate change, a lot of the climate science stuff coming out, you think, oh, it's just happening over there or it's happening out there and it seems too complicated or post-apocalyptic. But really, the things that are happening locally are more interesting in that we can really affect change that way. And so in our work, sort of thinking about what's sparking joy in the preservation work that we do and related to this topic, I see more ways in which our work in the preservation field will intersect with community activists and advocates. So for the next season of the podcast, we do spotlight quite a few community advocates in the climate space, how they're really pushing forward this agenda that's hyper local, and also like it'll benefit the wider New York City community once we put the right action plan in place. So yeah, so that's something that I'm excited about.
Pete, you got to unmute for us.
Sorry about that again.
Happens to the best of us. It's all right.
We at the Hip Hop Museum trying to cut back on events just because we have so much work to do to get open in time. However, fundraising is one of the biggest points of play right now as well. We're in the middle of a capital campaign to raise like the last $50 million to finish the entire project. So we have a gala event on June 27th scheduled. Our last one was very successful. We honored D Nice and DJ Red Alert, had De La Soul perform. So, through thhm.org, people can get tickets for that. And it's a great show and a great event and for a great cause to finish the Hip Hop Museum. So fundraising never ends in this world.
Well, I'm not sure we're going in order as such, but we just started our spring season on May 9th. I'm broadcasting to you from the Seaport District. We have a gallery here. We've been here for 7 years, and we do a series of events on Thursdays called Nerdy Thursdays, because our people who like comics and walks are often nerdy. We're going to have Terrence Floyd with us this Thursday, and we're going to reflect on just like the last 4 years and brainstorm what's coming up next. And for those who don't know Terrence Floyd, that's the brother of George Floyd. And so we have our walking experiences on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, or Nerdy Thursdays on Thursdays, and we have some exhibitions coming up. And so you can find out more about us on blackgotham.com and also our spring season. So we're pretty much just really getting to cook this year. So check that out.
All right. Delma, you got something to share with us?
Yeah, I'll just share the project that I'm excited about, which was recently announced, which is Lincoln Correctional Facility. It's just north of Central Park. It's an old vacant prison facility that is going to be converted to affordable housing. So really excited about that.
Thank you, Delma. Well, thank you so much to our panelists, and I will turn it over to Elizabeth to close us out.
Hi, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't, do I need to welcome Zara back to share the latest updates on her?
Sure, I can do that
Capturing.
as you close this out. I can pull that up right now. Yes. Please let me know when you can see the screen.
We're good.
Okay, so I'll just mention a couple of themes that I heard at that second piece of our conversation and pass it back to you, Elizabeth. So a couple of things that I wanted to indicate here as I listened and again created this visual guide that's going to help us remember what we talked about, share it with others, and synthesize some of the key points. A lot of talk about innovative funding ideas and kind of what's required to make so many of these changes and so many of these activities and things actually exist and come to life. We also talked a bit about how the participatory nature of this work is really something to think about from a long-term view. So not something that's quick and, one call to action to a community and we're done, something that really is an investment in a longer-term activation of a community. And on that note, thinking about kind of age and who is in this conversation, talking a bit about our youth and how hopeful, the youth may be a hopeful approach to how participatory and preservation in general, how that design is really just second nature to many of the youth in this world, in this work. They're not unlearning in the same way that some of us are. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of what's seen and unseen. So thinking about preservation of the built environment, we kind of know that, we understand that in many ways, but what's the unseen environment? What are the dreams, the long-term conversations, the music, the oral histories, right? What are we missing when we think about preservation there? So with that, I'll pass it back to Elizabeth to close us out, and I'll continue to work on this in the next couple moments to kind of make sure it holistically covers our conversation and our time together here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Zara. This is always amazingly fabulous to see a conversation turned into a visual record of a dialogue, and an evolving one at that. And I also want to thank Amanda, our fabulous moderator, and all our amazing speakers today, Faye and Shelley and Pete and Delma and Kamau. You were really inspiring to all of us, and I have really gotten us thinking today about the future of this project and all of our hopeful work together. I wanted to thank everyone who joined us today. We've had a great audience, and we very much appreciate your participation in this event as well. And I don't want to go away without thanking my wonderful colleagues who made this program happen. Carrie Butler, Rebecca Mackless, Genevieve Deloria, and Genevieve Wagner, who make these things come together when it doesn't seem possible. And we hope that you'll stay engaged with MAS by becoming a member if you are not a member now, and also to follow this project as it evolves. And a quick note about some of our upcoming programs on Tuesday, May 28th. Please join us for a virtual gallery talk with photographer Sally Davies, whose work is currently on view in our virtual gallery. Sally will be in conversation with me to explore themes of that exhibition, our internal and external relationship with the built environment. Very interesting work. And in early June, we'll be opening up nominations for our 2024 Masterworks Awards. These annual awards celebrate excellence in architecture, urban design across the 5 boroughs. And please, if you have great projects that have happened in 2023, we'd love you to share them with us, and please stay tuned for more details. And on Wednesday, June 26th, join us at Housing Works Bookstore for a conversation with Professor Terry Williams on his recent publication, Life Underground. This summer will be filled with other exciting programs and tours, so please keep an eye on your inbox and follow us on social media channels for upcoming announcements. And once again, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your day.